When I was a kid, we lived in a house that wasn't just old. It felt alive, like it had its own secrets it didn't want to share. It was a narrow, two-story place, built sometime in the 1940s, with faded yellow paint and a sagging roofline. From the outside, it looked like it had seen better days. From the inside, it was like stepping into a dark story waiting to unfold. I must have been around 7 when we moved in, and though we only stayed for about 2 years, it left an impression on me that hasn't faded, even decades later. At first, it was just little things, a creak here, a shadow there, the kind of stuff you'd expect from an old house. But the more time we spent there, the harder it was to ignore. Sometimes at night, I'd hear soft footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway. Other times I'd catch glimpses of shadows darting along the walls, even when I was alone. My parents brushed it off as just the house settling, but even at that age, I knew better. Houses don't settle with intent. What I remember most, though, is a doll. Not the kind of doll you'd find in a toy store or wrapped in plastic at a department store. This was a porcelain doll, delicate and eerie, dressed in a pale blue dress with white lace trim. She had blonde curls that framed her porcelain face, and she sat perched on a tiny swing, her painted eyes fixed in a gaze that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. My grandmother had given it to me when I was born, and though I don't recall ever asking for it, she insisted it was a family tradition. For years the doll stayed in its box, tucked away in some corner of the attic. That changed when I was around 10. By then I'd mostly outgrown my other toys, but for some reason I decided to take the doll out of the box. Maybe I was curious, maybe I was just bored. Either way, I hung her swing on a hook in my room, right above my bed. At first it didn't bother me. She was just another decoration, like the posters on my wall or the dream catcher by my window. But it didn't take long before I started to notice things. The first time it happened, I was half asleep. I remember feeling like I was being watched, but when I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The doll was still hanging there, swaying gently as if someone had just pushed the swing. I told myself it was just the draft from the open window and rolled over, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine. A week later, I had my first nightmare. In it, I was standing in a strange room. Not mine, but familiar in that dreamlike way where everything feels slightly off. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and sunlight streamed through sheer curtains, giving the space a warm glow. The doll was sitting on a shelf, her swing gone. At first, she was still, just staring ahead, but as I watched, she slowly turned her head toward me. Her painted lips curled into a smile, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could move, she stood up, her porcelain limbs bending in unnatural ways, and began to float toward me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room around me dark and silent, but the feeling of her presence lingered, like she'd followed me out of the dream. I wanted to tell my parents, but what would I say? That a doll was haunting me? They'd never believe it. So I kept quiet. The dreams didn't stop. Each night they grew worse. In one, the doll crawled out of her swing and perched on the edge of my bed, her glassy eyes inches from mine. In another, she appeared at the foot of the stairs, her head tilting side to side as if she were trying to figure out what I was. And every time I woke up feeling like I'd just escaped something I couldn't explain. It got to the point where I couldn't even look at her during the day. I tried turning her to face the wall, but it didn't help. No matter where I put her, I could feel her eyes on me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after another nightmare, I grabbed the doll, wrapped her in an old pillowcase, and stuffed her into the crawl space beneath the stairs. I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. Doors started to open and close on their own. I'd wake up to the sound of her swing creaking, even though she wasn't there anymore. Once, I swear I heard her whisper my name. I stopped sleeping in my room altogether, choosing instead to camp out on the couch in the living room. Even there, I didn't feel safe. Years later, when we finally moved out, I thought I was free of her. But as we were packing, my mom found the pillowcase in the crawl space. She laughed, saying I must have been scared of the doll as a kid. I told her to throw it away, but she insisted on keeping it, saying it was a family heirloom. I don't know what happened to it after that, and I don't want to know. Looking back, I can't say for sure what was real and what wasn't. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination. Maybe it was something darker. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear since, and I hope I never do again. It all started about 2 years ago when we moved into this house. At first, it seemed like any other home, old but full of charm, with its creaky floors and tall windows that let in warm sunlight during the day. I was thrilled to finally have my own space, a cozy bedroom tucked away in the corner of the house. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice things that didn't quite feel right. The first time it happened, I was alone. My parents were out for the evening, and I was curled up in the living room watching some mindless TV show. It was quiet, almost too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint but deliberate tapping sound coming from upstairs. My stomach clenched. I froze for a moment, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling or maybe the wind. But the tapping grew louder, sharper, as if someone was deliberately knocking on the walls. Panicked, I called 911, my hands trembling as I described what I thought was an intruder. The police arrived, checked every room, and found nothing. They were polite but skeptical, and as they left, I felt foolish, chalking it up to nerves. After all, it was a new house, and I wasn't used to its quirks yet. But that didn't explain what came next. It started small, barely noticeable things. At night, I'd hear the faintest whispers, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Sometimes I'd find objects slightly moved from where I'd left them, like my keys on the counter or a book on my bedside table. Then there were the knocking sounds, persistent, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. They seemed to echo from inside the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old house thing, something to do with the plumbing or the weather. But then my pet bird, a cheerful little parakeet, started acting strangely. He'd chirp frantically for no reason, his tiny body trembling as if he'd seen something I couldn't. His cage was near my closet, the one place I couldn't bring myself to go near at night. And inside that closet, in the farthest corner, sat the doll. It wasn't just any doll. It was an antique, passed down through my family for generations. I kept it in a box, partly because it was fragile, but mostly because it unsettled me. There was something about its glassy eyes and stiff smile that made my skin crawl. And yet I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It was family history after all, or so I told myself. Around the same time, strange things began happening with my electronics. My TV would flicker or change channels on its own. My radio would blare static in the middle of the night. And then there was the time my phone, brand new and barely a month old, malfunctioned during a call with a friend. One moment we were laughing, and the next, the screen went black. My friend's voice sounded distant, distorted, as if she were calling from another world. And then, out of nowhere, the blanket covering me was yanked off with such force that I screamed. Months passed, and the incidents seemed to die down, almost as if whatever was causing them had gone dormant. I started to feel safe again, convinced it was all in my head, but this morning proved me wrong. I woke up just after 3:30 a.m., a heavy pressure weighing down on my shoulder. Half asleep, I assumed it was our dog lying next to me, but when I reached out, my hand met empty air. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Our dog wasn't even in the room, and yet the pressure remained. cold and unrelenting, as if an invisible hand was gripping me. By now, I'm convinced it all circles back to that doll. Every time I hear the low, guttural growling near the closet, or notice the strange way the air feels heavier in its corner, I think about getting rid of it. But how do you destroy something that's been in your family for generations? Something that feels alive? I've tried reasoning it away. Maybe it's just bad luck, like when my bird suddenly fell ill and died. Or maybe it's the power of suggestion. But deep down, I know better. I can feel the malice emanating from that doll. Subtle, but undeniable. I even reached out to a paranormal investigator who spent decades studying cases like mine. She's eager to examine the doll, but I'm not sure I want to hand it over. It feels like a betrayal, like I'd be unleashing something dark and uncontrollable into the world. For now, the doll remains in its box, and I remain here, typing this out in the dead of night. The faint sound of tapping echoing in my ears. Maybe tomorrow I'll gather the courage to burn it, or maybe, like always, I'll convince myself it's nothing and go on pretending everything is fine. But deep down, I know the truth. This isn't over, not by a long shot. It started as a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when I could unwind after a long day. My girlfriend Mia was recovering from a nasty fall during a horseback riding lesson, which meant I was handling everything around the house, including taking care of our 3 dogs, Riley, Max, and Penny. Normally, Mia and I walked the dogs together, but tonight I decided to let her rest. After finishing dinner, I realized the dogs were starting to get restless. If I didn't take them out soon, they'd turn the apartment into a circus. It was just past 8 o'clock, and the sky had dimmed into a deep indigo, with the last streaks of sunlight clinging to the horizon. We lived in a quiet college town, the kind where people left their doors unlocked and jogged alone at odd hours without a second thought. Our usual route was a park near the edge of town, a sprawling green space with winding trails, clusters of trees, and dimly lit paths. It was peaceful and familiar, a place I'd walked 100 times before without a single uneasy moment. Tonight, though, there was an odd stillness in the air, the kind that makes you notice the creak of your own footsteps. I leashed up the dogs and headed out, the cool night air brushing against my face. The park was mostly empty, save for a few distant figures, joggers, I assumed. The dogs tugged at their leashes excitedly as we made our way to an open clearing where they could run free. Once there, I unclipped their leashes and let them bolt into the grass, their glowing collars bouncing like little fireflies in the dark. Leaning against a tree, I peeled a granola bar and popped in my earbuds, scrolling through my playlist for something mellow. The faint hum of music filled my ears as I watched the dogs chase each other in circles. It was one of those rare moments of calm, the kind where you can almost feel your stress melting away. That calm didn't last long. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone walking toward me along the trail. At first, I thought nothing of it. People passed by all the time. But as he drew closer, something about him felt off. He was tall and unusually thin, his frame almost skeletal, and he moved with an unnatural slowness, as though he was gliding instead of walking. The dim glow of the streetlight caught his face, and I felt a jolt of unease. His expression was utterly blank, like someone wearing a poorly made mask. He wasn't looking down or around, just straight ahead, his eyes fixed on me with a cold, unblinking stare. In his arms he cradled something, but I couldn't make out what it was. The way his arms moved slightly back and forth, it looked like he was rocking a baby. But as he got closer, the shape in his arms became clearer, and my stomach twisted. It wasn't a baby, it was a doll. A pale plastic baby doll, limp and lifeless, its painted eyes staring blankly at the sky. The dogs hadn't noticed him yet, too busy nosing around in the grass, but my unease was growing by the second. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just some eccentric guy out for a walk. But the way he carried himself, The way his head turned ever so slightly to keep me in his line of sight sent chills racing up my spine. "Hey, you good?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his head tilting ever so slightly as if studying me. His stare was unrelenting and his lips were pressed into a thin, unmoving line. As he passed, I caught a whiff of something faint but unpleasant, like old damp fabric. I turned back to the dogs, pretending not to care, but my hands were shaking. Riley barked once, his ears pricking up, and Penny let out a low growl, something she almost never did. When I glanced back over my shoulder, the man had stopped walking. He was standing under the streetlight, his back to me. Slowly, his head began to turn, too slowly, until his face was once again fixed in my direction. My heart hammered in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Mia. "Hey, stay on the line with me," I said as soon as she picked up. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice immediately concerned. "Just talk to me, okay?" "Keep talking." I kept glancing back, trying to act natural, but every time I looked, he was still there, still staring. At one point, he took a single step forward, and I swear I felt my blood turn to ice. "What's happening?" Mia pressed. "There's this guy," I muttered, keeping my voice low. "He's weird. He's holding a doll and he's just staring." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Get out of there. Now." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and whistled for the dogs. They came bounding back, their glowing collars casting strange shadows as they moved. I clipped on their leashes as fast as I could and started walking briskly toward the exit. But I couldn't help myself. I had to look back. The man was still there, but now he was facing me fully, the doll still cradled in his arms. His head tilted slightly to one side as if puzzled by my retreat. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. With the dogs pulling at their leashes, I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my ears. By the time I reached the edge of the park, I risked one last glance. He was gone. I rushed home, locked every door and window, and sat on the couch with all 3 dogs pressed against me. I didn't tell Mia everything. I didn't want to scare her more than I already had. But I couldn't shake the image of that man, his blank stare, and the eerie stillness of the doll in his arms. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the apartment felt like footsteps, every shadow like a figure waiting just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was just some harmless weirdo, but deep down I knew better. In the summer of 1998, I found myself in the heart of Detroit, working on a contract job with one of my closest friends, Mason. We were tasked with upgrading the electrical systems in an old, abandoned hotel on Gratiot Avenue. The building, once a bustling Art Deco gem, had been a casualty of decades of neglect. It still stood tall, but wore its years like a tattered coat, its grandeur dimmed by time. The contract required us to work odd hours to avoid disrupting the ongoing renovations, and Mason and I agreed to switch to night shifts. We figured the quiet hours would make our work easier, though it wasn't lost on us how eerie the place felt after dark. The only other presence in the building was a watchman named Joe, a grizzled old man who carried the air of someone who'd seen too much, but spoke too little. He mostly kept to himself, patrolling the shadowy hallways with a flashlight that seemed inadequate against the oppressive gloom. One Friday night, around 2 a.m., Mason and I were wrapping up the wiring on the top floor. The task involved threading cables down through conduit pipes connecting each floor. To make things more challenging, the only working elevator in the building was an antiquated service lift that required one person to operate manually. It clanked and groaned like it might give up at any moment. We had to take turns riding it up and down, holding the controls in place while the other secured the cables on each floor. The night was going smoothly, until it wasn't. We had just finished on the 14th floor and were preparing to descend to the 8th, when Mason realized we'd left a spool of wire behind on the 22nd floor. Grumbling about the oversight, we rode the elevator back up. When we stepped out, the air felt heavier, like the floor itself was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it at first. Old buildings have a way of exhaling their age in strange ways. The paper taped by the elevator doors read 22, the faded ink confirming we were where we needed to be. We grabbed the spool and decided to check the wiring one last time before heading back down. That's when things started to feel off. The hallways on each floor had distinct patterns in the carpeting, little details to help navigate the otherwise identical layouts. On the 22nd, the carpet was supposed to have a faded maroon floral design, but as I glanced around, it was a muted blue with swirling geometric patterns. I nudged Mason and asked if he noticed it too. He shrugged, chalking it up to my overtired mind playing tricks. We walked back toward the elevator, and when I reached for the button, I froze. The paper beside the door no longer read 22. It said 14. Mason, didn't we just come from 22? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Of course we did, he replied, confused. He pointed to the spool of wire in his hands. Why else would we have this? I pressed the button, and the elevator arrived with its usual screeching protest. We stepped inside, and I jabbed the button for the 8th floor. The elevator lurched to life, rattling as it descended. But when the doors opened, we weren't on the 8th floor. The number on the paper outside read 22 again. Mason and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken dread thickening the air between us. We stepped out cautiously, only to find the blue geometric carpet waiting for us. My pulse quickened. Let's take the stairs, I whispered. We found the stairwell and began descending. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of our footfalls seemed to echo unnaturally, bouncing back as though something was following us. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the 12th floor. Or at least, it should have been the 12th. But when we opened the door, we were back on the 22nd floor, staring at the same blue carpet and dim hallway. Panic set in. Mason grabbed my arm, his grip tight. We're stuck, he said, his voice trembling. This isn't right. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I bolted back to the stairs, Mason trailing behind me, his footsteps loud and desperate. We ran down flight after flight, refusing to stop. I lost count of how many floors we passed, but when we finally burst through a door, we weren't in the lobby. We were back on the 22nd floor. The elevator stood open, its dim orange light casting long shadows. It was as if it had been waiting for us. I felt something shift in the air, an unseen presence pressing down on us. Without thinking, I grabbed Mason and we darted back into the stairwell, running as fast as our legs could carry us. This time, when we reached the bottom, we emerged into the lobby. Joe was there, leaning on his flashlight, his face unreadable. He didn't ask why we looked so shaken, nor did he comment when Mason and I announced that we were done for the night and wouldn't be returning. Even now, years later, Mason and I still call each other to talk about that night. Neither of us has a logical explanation. Whenever someone hears the story, they laugh it off or call it a prank. But I know what I saw, what I felt. There's something wrong with that hotel, something that defies reason. Sometimes in the dead of night, I wonder if we ever really left the 22nd floor, or if it's still waiting for us to come back.